and welcome to episode 2 of season 2 of Mums.Dads.Work. I'm Ben Falk, I'm the editor of Workingmums.co.uk. I'm here with
Mandy, Garner, editor of Workingmums.co.uk.
I didn't know whether I was supposed to say your name or let you say it, but I let you say it.
Thank you. Very kind.
So thanks very much for joining us. It's been great coming back with another episode of the pod, another season of the pod. As we've kind of talked about here and online and on social, we slightly tweaked this season. We've got a lot more practical advice. So we're chatting a little bit about stuff that's affecting working parents, working mums, working dads. And we've got some good guests today as well, giving us some really practical advice. We sat down with a couple of people, didn't we, Mandy?
Yes, we did. Some flexible working experts who a job share themselves, which is great.
Amazing. We'll get to them in a second. But this week is it International Mental Health Day or World? I think it's World.
It's World.
World, yes, World Mental Health Day. We've written a lot about male mental health, particularly, seems to be a hot topic for me. But you've written a lot about mental health recently too, haven't you?
Yes, it was one of the things that came up in our annual survey. And I think it also came up last week for National Work Life Week in the Working Families survey as well. So we were really interested not only in parents' mental health, but also the impact of children's mental health on parents' mental health. So we looked at all those kind of things, and I've been speaking to mums who have been, trying to manage children's mental health, particularly things like school refusal, which is really, really difficult and challenging to manage. And I've had experience of it myself way before COVID, actually, with school bullying and stuff like that, leading to panic attacks. And it's just really, really hard to force. You feel like you're forcing your child into school when they're literally shaking.
It's a bizarre thing, isn't it? Because the people that get annoyed with wokery or whatever you want to call it, or kind of say that we're talking too much about sort of touchy-feely mental health things, but it's amazing. We talk about it loads, and yet it's still so prevalent. Like, it seems like we're making headway, but I don't know. It seems to be tiny increments. From a dad's perspective, I think me and my friends are quite open, but probably we're in the minority. I don't know.
Yes, I think there's still quite a bit of stigma about it, but also I think that there's so many different pressures on people, and it's been spoken about a lot during COVID and in the post-COVID thing. There was a report out on school refusal, for example, very recently, and I think that it is being spoken about a lot, but there's just not the resources there at all if anybody's been sort of, particularly as a parent, trying to get children sort of support, it's so, it takes so long. The CAMS waiting list is enormous, and it's just really, really hard. And the schools,
postcode lottery, I think, isn't it, really? Like, some places are better than others, and it really depends on where you are in the country as well.
yes, it does. But also, I mean, there's obviously lots of things that have come about as a result, or that as of COVID, but also that COVID is accentuated. And there's been all the kind of, change, which, some people don't cope with, find it more difficult to cope with than others. And all anxiety and bereavement and all the other things that we've been dealing with, which we haven't even had a sort of breath to stop and actually sort of take stock of what we've all been through, really. Then workload, work pressures and all of that kind of thing, which tends to sometimes get a little bit overlooked in the talk about mental health at work. There's a lot sometimes on different types of mental health problems and all that kind of stuff, but they're kind of not related to work and workload and intensity of work. So there's all of those kind of things. But for younger people, I just think there's the mental health figures were going, they were bad before COVID, way before COVID. And there's just a lot of different pressures on young people, I think. And, just dealing with teenagers. It's a roller coaster. It really is. It really is.
I remember chatting about 5 years ago to, I was kind of, my daughters were significantly younger then. And I was like, right, is there a way to kind of make sure that things are okay? And I spoke to this brilliant child psychiatrist, actually, who did loads of stuff with the court. He does really quite intensive things with kids, and his advice, I said, like, how do I just how do I protect them? How to protect them? And his advice actually was very simple, which was take care of yourself. And it was, obviously that's a straightforward way of, a very simplified way of saying it, but it really is that put on the life jacket yourself first. And then if you've done that, then your children's life jacket will be a lot easier to deal with. But I'm quite bad at taking advice, like remembering advice, but I genuinely have like maintained that one the entire time. Make sure that if I'm okay, then they'll probably be okay. Obviously incredibly simplified, but that's like that's always been I can hear this guy's voice ringing in my head like 5 or 6 years later, and it's something it's one of those pieces of advice I've always tried to stick to.
Yeah, I think that's a really good piece of advice. I mean, I remember speaking to a mum who her daughter was in a psychiatric unit. It was very serious. I mean, when people talk about wokery and mental health, you think some of these things are incredibly serious things.
Yeah.
She tried to commit suicide several times. She was knocking her head against the walls and stuff like that. And the mum was working, and luckily I think her employer was fairly flexible, but she was going every night to the unit, and she was changed from unit to unit, so could be quite far from her home and everything. And there were kind of support groups, parent support groups at different units and stuff, but she just simply didn't have the time, because she wanted to spend the time that she had with her daughter, because she was absolutely frantically worried about her daughter. And I think that's quite difficult somehow. And sometimes there's sort of guilt factors and things involved, and you're thinking, is it my fault, and all that kind of stuff. So you don't feel that you can. It's very complicated, but it is important to look after yourself as well, because you are the main person. It's
always terrifying as a parent, isn't it, when you kind of go, oh God, wish they could be the best parts of me rather than the worst parts of me. And any self-aware person knows all their faults, and then, or at least some of their faults, and then you kind of go, just please, can you somehow eradicate those bits from them? And then when you see it, inevitably they take on some of your worst traits, which is always depressing. So yeah, but anyway, it's World Mental Health Day this week, and I would say, really take stock of it. It's not just it is just a day, but it's like, this is a thing that it's really important. Think about it, do research, and take care of yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And part of that in terms of the workplace, I think, is obviously flexible working, which brings us on to our guests. We've got with us today, we've got Tabytha Cunningham and Charlotte Farrell from Paris Smith Solicitors. They're on our panel of employment law experts who you can send email questions into, and they will answer. Charlotte and Tabytha do a job share at Paris Smith, and they're going to talk about all things flexible working. Welcome to the Mums.Dads.Work podcast, Charlotte and Tabytha. It's really good to have you here. So what I wanted to ask you first is, you're a job share partnership within a law firm. So I wanted to ask you how that came about, and a little bit about what the benefits are to working in that way. So Tabytha, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, Charlotte and I were really lucky that we had our first children at the same time, and both being employment lawyers, I think we immediately jumped to the idea of a job share because we saw that it could work for us. So we took our time setting it up initially to make sure that it works. So what we do is we work 3 days a week each. So we have a crossover day on a Wednesday when we're both in the office, and we've set up a shared email address and have shared phone numbers. So we literally share everything between us. I think the main benefit for us is that we genuinely get to have our 2 days out of the office, which is obviously the most difficult thing of working part-time. I think is often you end up doing a full-time role and being paid part-time because you're called upon. So we always know that the other one's there, and that's fantastic, and it works really well for us.
Yes, and Charlotte, every year we look at the sort of numbers on job share on our annual survey, and they don't seem to go up very much. What do you think is behind that? Why do you think employers are reluctant?
So I don't think it's that employers are necessarily reluctant or that job shares themselves don't work. I think the problem can be finding the right opportunity to job share and the right person to job share with. As Tabytha said, we'd worked together before we started job sharing. We'd both done the role before we started job sharing, and it was something that we were familiar with, and that made it a lot easier. For us, I think that if someone's moving to a job share in a role that they've not done before, or with someone they've not worked with before, that can be much more challenging. I think it's really worth doing. It's just making sure that you've got the building blocks in place to make sure it works and thought through how it's going to work before that job share starts, so that it can be a success from the start and people can work in that way really well, because it can bring huge benefits and not just in law but in lots of other areas as well.
I just wondered whether you have ever struggled with it. Are there, I'm not trying to kind of criticize it, but are there, what kind of, I suppose some of the things that people might be going is like, I like the idea of a job share, but I'm worried about some of the problems with it. What are the things that you have found are tricky sometimes, and how have you kind of got over that, Charlotte?
I think for us, it's communication is key, and I'm sure that's the same for all job shares. I mean, we are very lucky. We are very similar people outside of work and inside of work. Kind of the conversations we have with our children seem to be spookily similar, from one week to the next. I think for us, we've been very lucky there. Communication and making sure that you update each other on what you've done. So if you are sharing tasks, making sure that you've got a clear kind of way of making sure everybody knows who's done what and when you've done it, so things don't slip through the net, is really important. And just being open and honest as well, and having those conversations. If you don't agree with what someone's done, finding a way to be able to share that and kind of move forward, or if it's causing you a problem. But I think it's like with everything, it comes down to communication and being prepared to kind of work through those challenges together as well, not kind of blaming each other, kind of having each other's back as well, and kind of being there to support each other.
Yeah, no, that's really important.
I think often it's about communicating with the people that you work with as well. I think now where we work, everyone knows how we work, all of our clients know how we work, and they're very open to that, and people say all the time that they think it's fantastic. I think at first it was just communicating to others how we were working and making sure that they understood that they could go to both of us, that it wasn't just waiting for one of us to be back in, and how we wanted to communicate with other people as well. So I think that can be a challenge at first, but again, once you've got it set up, it becomes second nature to colleagues and clients or customers as well.
Yeah, that's certainly, I've done a few job shares in my time, and certainly the communication thing. I just remember the first one I did, we didn't have any crossover day at all, and we did quite separate, we had separate sort of skills, which can be a bonus with a job share, but I just don't think the communication was the best. It was a long time ago, and it was before there was any sort of best practice or anything on job shares. So yeah. And in terms of sort of flexible working generally, flexible working rights and things, I just wondered if you could, Charlotte, sort of outline some of what the current legislation is on flexible working.
Yeah, of course. So currently, once you've been employed somewhere for approximately 6 months, you have the right to make a statutory flexible working request. So that's kind of the legal request. Although technically anyone can ask their employer at any time to work flexibly. It's just that the employer doesn't have to respond kind of in quite such a structured way to those types of requests. Employees can make one request every 12 months under the statutory scheme, and there's quite specific information they have to give. So you have to submit it in writing, you have to explain what the changes you're looking for, and also explain how any kind of hiccups could be addressed. If it's going to cause a problem for the business, or you think there could be a consequence for the business, you need to explain kind of what that could be and how that could be dealt with as well as part of the request. And then the employer at the moment has 3 months to go through a process to kind of decide whether or not they're going to agree to the request and to respond to it. And at the moment, businesses can only refuse a request based on 8 business grounds, and they are very specific. But normally most businesses are able to find one that does fit if they do want to refuse the request, unfortunately, although there is quite a lot of scope for employees to show that actually they can kind of get over those hurdles in their request.
Tabytha, I was kind of interested, obviously we've got mums and dads kind of represented in this podcast. What's your sense of, I'm not going to pit them against each other, but like how many women or mothers and how many fathers are kind of trying to take on, we know that flexible working has changed and evolved. Do you see a gender split here? Do you see a kind of parental difference in who's taking more flexible working and kind of organising flexible working?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's still an imbalance in that statistically more women than men request flexible working, and the most common time that people make a request is following a return from maternity leave. I think what we have seen, particularly post-COVID, is more perhaps informal flexible working or minor changes to hours being submitted by men. So for example, perhaps condensing hours so they get an afternoon off, or perhaps working earlier to do a school pickup later. So I think definitely those kind of requests to perhaps adjust hours have increased from males, but generally when we're looking at the more formal requests to say, well, I want to reduce my hours to 4 days a week or to do something like that, statistically it still tends to be more women. Hopefully it will continue to change, and it used to be that flexible working requests were more specific and you had to be making them for specified reasons, and for the last couple of years it has been anyone that can make them for any reason. So it doesn't have to be childcare related. It could be that you want to go and coach a football team in the afternoon on one day. So that's been a positive move forward. But I think we still need more time to get more equality there.
And so on that sort of, you don't, because I think people sometimes think that they have to make their case, not necessarily the business case, but more sort of say why they need the flexible working, but they don't actually have to specify that it's for childcare reasons or anything like that, do they?
They don't, and the flexible working regime is just designed to be, for any reason. I think if you are making a flexible working request that's connected to childcare or other caring responsibilities, it is important to explain that, because what it gives you is additional rights in terms of discrimination protection. So the rights to enforce the flexible working request kind of rules themselves are relatively limited. So if it is connected to childcare and we can then demonstrate that it perhaps amounts to discrimination if that's refused, that kind of strengthens your options. So it's always a good idea, but it's certainly not required.
I mean, are you seeing, we talk when we write about stuff, and we're writing a lot about how companies have to sort of listen to their workers and sort of think about introducing flexibility in a much broader way, in a much more transparent way. Are you seeing people kind of leaving jobs and stuff because there is a perceived lack of flexibility, or I suppose engaging your services?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're necessarily seeing a lot more people leaving without having those conversations with their employers. I think most people are having those conversations, but I think there is a lot more frustration amongst employees now when employers aren't willing to have those conversations, in terms of it being much more talked about now and much more available across employers and across other roles as well. I think ultimately someone will leave if they're not able to get the hours that they need, particularly if there's a reason they're asking for flexible working. But I don't think there's necessarily been a big increase in that kind of recently. I think that's always been there, but it hasn't been as talked about as much as it's now being done.
Yeah. And how is the law changing? We know that there's new legislation. It's been flagged a lot in the newspapers, and I think sometimes people think once it's being flagged that it's happening immediately, but it's not happening immediately. But what will those changes that are coming, what will they mean?
Yeah, so the first change is that they're going to make flexible working a day one right, which is what most of the headlines have been about. So at the minute, you have to wait till you've been employed by the company for 6 months before you can formally make a request. And that's going to happen from the first day that you walk into the door. So that gives people the advantage that it kind of brings those conversations forward to the initial employment stage, which will hopefully mean that people are more open to having these discussions when you're being recruited, as opposed to once you're already in post. They're also increasing the limits on the request. So at the moment, you can only make one formal request every 12 months, and it's going to be 2. And they're also going to reduce the time frame to consider a request. So at the minute, your employer has 3 months to go through the process of a request. That's going to be reduced to 2 months. There's also going to be some kind of tweaks to the consultation process. So the ACAS guidance surrounding flexible working requests in particular is going to be changed. And there's going to be more emphasis on consulting with employees before reaching a decision, as opposed to just kind of jumping through hoops and having a meeting with them. There's also in the guidance going to be a change to kind of put more of a presumption on employers to start from the basis that they should be accepting rather than refusing requests. And there's also going to be a requirement under the guidance so that if an employer is looking to reject a request, they should also proactively consider alternatives before they do that, which at the moment lots of employers will do and will say, well, look, we can't agree to you working 3 days a week, but we could agree to you working 4. But it's kind of putting that emphasis on having those conversations and being more collaborative about it.
That's interesting. Charlotte, I wonder whether put you on the spot, whether there's I don't know, talk on the legal grapevine about that, that there is sort of further change coming down the pipe, or this is a thing which seems to change both logistically and sort of policy wise and legally quite slowly? I mean, is there a sense that we're on a kind of train to a total change, or is it going to be these kind of incremental things every 3, 5, 10 years? I don't know whether you kind of talk about that in the practice.
Yeah, so I mean, any government likes to play with employment law. It's the topic of law that gets changed the most. It gets the headlines, people are interested in it, and it affects people on a day-to-day business basis as well. So we're quite used to seeing kind of regular changes to the law. I don't think there's necessarily going to be a complete kind of change through everything in the near future. Obviously, that this isn't yet in force, although it should be seen. And I think it is an area that is likely to be played with and tweaked again in the future, once businesses have got their heads around the new changes and employees have started to use it. And I think some employers are already taking that wider approach anyway, and some employers are already taking the approach of, well, actually all roles can be worked relatively flexibly. We've seen a lot more home working than we ever did before COVID. So I think some employers are already kind of voluntarily going down that route. So it'd be interesting to see what happens next.
Yes, it is interesting to see what happens next, because at the same time that obviously COVID has brought quite a lot of change and sort of movement forward, particularly with hybrid and remote working, we're also seeing a bit of a backlash with employers sort of, now sort of specifying you have to be in the office this amount of days, and that seems to be creeping up. The amount of days that they're expecting people to be back in the office seems to be creeping up. Tabytha, is there anything that people can actually do if they, for example, I know people that have moved, house to, further away because they thought they would be working more remotely or in a more hybrid way, and then they're being asked now to come back to the office 3 or 4 days a week. What legal rights do they have in that sort of situation?
Yeah, as you say, it's something we're seeing more and more now, because I think a lot of employers made quite informal changes to their policy arrangements due to COVID. Obviously, we were all forced into it straight away. So employers are in a position where they've agreed to lots of things, on a temporary basis, and that's fallen into the longer term. I think if you're in a situation where you were relying on a kind of company-wide policy that's just been quite flexible and has meant that people can work from home, and now that's being rowed back on, and it particularly affects you because of your personal arrangements, and again, particularly if they're related to childcare or other caring responsibilities, I think the thing to do would be to raise that with your employer, and ultimately you can then make a formal flexible working request against the changes to say, look, I understand that this is being changed to X. For me, that doesn't work for these reasons. So can I formally make a flexible working request to alter it? Because whilst the company can say, well, the general policy is now this, you've still got that right to request changes to that policy. I think the other thing, if you're in that situation, is to look back on the communications from your employer as time has gone back to see whether they were put forward as just temporary, or whether there were nuggets in there that you relied on as being more permanent changes. Because if you have an argument to say, well, your contract has permanently been varied so that you are a home worker, then that throws in kind of breach of contract and other legal arguments as well. So I would say probably a two-pronged approach of making it clear what you need personally, having a look to see what can you rely on it in what was promised to you in the past.
Fascinating. Charlotte, just to follow up from what Tabytha was saying there, just on that note, if people are saying, or if works are saying, which I've seen anecdotally, like you have to be in on a Wednesday because we're going to get everybody in on a Wednesday. If they're specifying a day, is that okay? Is like, or is that fold into what Tabytha is saying? If you're saying, well, actually, to Wednesday, just hypothetically, Wednesday is the day when I do have to have my child at home or whatever it might be. Does that make any difference?
Yeah, so it does fold into what Tabytha is saying. It's kind of part of the discussion that you'd need to have with your employer. And I think it does make a difference in terms of the reason for you making the request. So if you're making the request to work flexibly, work from home, or leave earlier because of a childcare commitment in particular, that's going to hold more weight in terms of the request that you're making. But also, I think proactively being able to come up with alternative solutions. So if your employer is saying to you, we want to have an org teams meeting and we've decided we're going to do that on a Wednesday, then having a conversation with them to say, well, could it be a Tuesday? Or, is there a reason for it being a Wednesday? Or is it just that the business have gone, well, it's the middle of the week yeah, that's the best day for us sort of approach. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a two-pronged approach. And also as an individual, sometimes it's possible to have flexibility as well. So, for example, you might normally work certain days in a week and you want to work those regularly moving forward, but you're prepared to, on an ad hoc basis, attend something, on your non-working days if it's needed, not as a regular occurrence, but as a one-off in an absolute emergency. And that's something that you can kind of feed in as an employee to any request as well, to say, look, if needed, I'd be prepared to do something that absolutely had to be, and I could get childcare, for example. It just kind of sometimes can help push applications in your favour.
Great.
Fantastic.
It's all about the communication, the negotiation, and all of that kind of thing. Well, it's certainly a really interesting time to be in employment rights and certainly in terms of flexible working. So thank you both so much for taking part in Mums.Dads.Work podcast. And I hope that that's been really informative for our listeners.
Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So some great advice there from Charlotte and Tabytha on flexible working. So we wanted to talk now, have a little bit more of a kind of a more relaxed session on books about working parents, which there are many at the moment. And we've certainly been doing at Working Mums. We did a whole big summer book club and had reviews of books practically every week, I think, over the summer. But it's something we're doing on an ongoing basis. And I know that, Ben, you've been doing some book reviews.
Yeah, well, it's interesting actually. Like I read the summer book series, and there's loads. And every week I'm seeing another book, Matrescence, or I think that's how you say it,
Yes.
And various other things. And so as a result, I kind of looked in the library and looked on the bookshelves and looked on the site that should not be named, and it was like really nothing for dads at all. It was kind of surprising. There were, I think, more practical kind of things, like sort of almost like what to do when you're expecting type books. But less, but fewer books about actually kind of being a dad. One of the ones that I just read, I then saw it on the Magnificent Libraries, Love Local Libraries, was Normal Schmormal by, I think it's Ashley Blaker, and him and his wife have 6 children, several of whom have learning differences and are SEND children, special educational needs children. And it's kind of dealing with that and like being a father to that. And it's pretty hardcore read. Like he's a comedian, so he's funny, but it's interesting. We were talking before we spoke to Charlotte and Tabytha about not having any time and taking care of yourself, and I think reading that book, the Normal Schmormal book, is you really get a sense of that. Like so much time is taken up with the kind of day-to-day, the kind of logistics of children, and that's definitely what you get with him. I mean, his book is more, as I say, it's a kind of slightly comedic book. I don't think it's as funny as he thinks, in the sense that I don't mean that in a criticism of his comedy. What I mean is that in terms of it comes across as like he makes light of something that's probably quite a challenge, but
which is probably his way of dealing with it.
Absolutely,
and life generally.
And he's clearly a magnificent father, and his wife a magnificent mother, but it really kind of showed the kind of level of intensity of like being a parent to 6 children, full stop. That was more kind of, I was like, mate, 6 kids, that's crazy.
Yeah. It's funny because I'm writing, it's not a proper, not a book for sale or anything like that, but I'm putting together the blogs that I've done over the years for Working Mums, which I've done lots of family sort of related blogs, and what I thought were kind of light-hearted, fun things. I'm reading through them and I'm thinking, God, I must be exhausted. Because when you write down, the daily sort of things that you're dealing with, like norovirus, I mean, nits, norovirus, they seem to come around all the time. Any time that there was any break.
Well, obviously, chickenpox doesn't come around more than once. Well, it comes multiple times if you've got several children. It seems to be one after the other, obviously, but God, nits is the bane of our life.
But the books that we've done over there, I agree that there's not enough about for dads, definitely, and by dads, about dads. But you mentioned Matrescence, which is one that we looked at, Lucy Jones's book, which is about sort of hormonal changes and all the different changes of body and mind after having a baby, which there was something in the news about last week, which is really interesting. And I think you've done something on dads brains changing. And after birth, we also have done Lucy Ryan's book Revolting Women, which is great, which is all about middle-aged women in middle age, which is a kind of very feisty sort of look at everything that women are facing in middle age, not just menopause. I mean, there's been a lot about menopause, but there's so many other things going on. And then Mother Tongue by Jenny Nussle, which is an amazing book. I mean, it's absolutely packed. It's academic. It's by an academic, and it's about the words that are used to describe different, women's lives. But it's really about women's, and it's also about women's history, the day-to-day, the everyday. But every chapter is absolutely crammed full of such interesting stuff taken from literature and stuff like that. And it's not written in an academic way, but there's just so much. It was one of those books that you could just read again and again and again. It just tells you stuff that you just like, wow, I didn't know, what it was like being a woman back in the day.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's difficult, I think, to like balance between being sort of academic and being kind of listy about like, these are the things that we do and actually something that absorbs you into the story and into the kind of narrative of their life. There was a book I'm doing a thing at the moment on, it came out initially last year and is due to come out in paperback early next year, by Sophie Gallagher, called How Men Can Help, which is more to do less about like fatherhood and everything, and more to do with being a better ally to women and that kind of thing. And I think it's really hard sometimes with non-fiction books to kind of pull people in, make people absorb that information without seeming like you're kind of being preachy and or that you're just reading a textbook. I think, Sophie does a good job. I call her Sophie like I know her. I don't.
Yes. Yeah.
But Sophie Gallagher does a good job of that, I think. But and by the way, I would say that anyone's listening to this, if you do have books, new books, not I don't really want ones from like the 90s, new books about fatherhood or being a dad or being a working father, then please do get in contact on social or on via the website, because I'd love to find more.
Yes, there's a lot on motherhood, definitely. And the thing about the Jenny Nussle one is it's not just about history, but it's about the evolution of words that are used about women. And so that's really fascinating, because it's like the words that we use now, where did they come from? Why? What are the connotations that they grew up with? There's just so much. It's really, really rich. But yeah, I wish there were more similar ones.
I'm assuming it's,
for the dads.
I'm assuming it's about it all comes from the patriarchy and it's bad.
It's much more interesting than you might think.
I don't mean that in a negative way.
Yeah.
I just mean, obviously men have decided those kind of, have always decided that to be in charge of that language. So I'm just kind of intrigued by that.
Yeah, no, it's much more. It's like, it's definitely worth reading. It's like one of those books that kind of opens up your mind. It's like, it's a good one.
Excellent. Well, look, we're going to, as Mandy said, we're going to carry on kind of doing the summer book series. It's going to become the all-round autumn year book series. So we're going to consistently do reviews and things like that. So if there are any books that you want us to feature on the site, then please do get in contact. But that's pretty much us done for this week, Mandy.
Yes, lovely.
We're back in a couple of weeks' time with Liz Seabag Montefiore talking about career progression. She's going to be our expert, loads of amazing advice, and we'll be chatting about all the kind of news for working mums and dads and whatever else is going on.
And it'll almost be half term. Can you believe it already?
Okay. Right, well, that's probably what we'll be chatting about then. What the hell are we going to do in half term?
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much, Mandy. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.